Well, I want to start by saying welcome to this fantastic location. The audience has got the best of it because you're looking at these great Lamassu sculptures. Elif and I are looking at the crouching Venus back there, who's not quite as impressive, I have to say. I'm Mary Beard, and I am a trustee of the British Museum, and that is why I have had the real good luck to be able to get this gig talking to Elif, who is a leading light of contemporary fiction. And in her new book, which you all, I hope, have a copy for, There Are Rivers in the Sky, she gives more than a cameo role to the museum and to the Assyrian collection and to the original home of the Assyrian sculptures. So there is no better place whatsoever to be discussing the book than right here, and we feel very, very privileged. Just for the bit of housekeeping, which I'll do to begin with, we're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be about 20 minutes discussion. And then there's more to consume, just back to the right. So we hope that you'll stay and enjoy. I should also, because I mustn't forget this at the end, thank Elif's publishers, Viking, for helping with this, and all the staff at the British Museum, including Sebastian Ray, who knows much more about Assyrian sculptures, I would guess, than anybody else in the room, had really helped us get this together. And we're absolutely delighted to be here in what I hope will be the first of many such pop-up events here, talking about things that resonate with the BM collection. So it's great. And Elif was the catalyst to this and the excuse, so it's wonderful. I want to start, though, by asking Elif to, as it were, get us in the groove, because this novel is what I would now call classic Shafak, that there are three main interwoven storylines that go across time and place. And in order that those who haven't yet read it, but you'll be able to take it home and read it tonight, I thought it would be helpful if we just got what those three storylines are, and then we can have a more general discussion. But Elif, the kind of protagonist of the BM storyline is a guy in your books that you call Arthur Smythe, who goes right through the book. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
First of all, thank you. Thank you so much. I am, to be honest, not only excited, a little bit overwhelmed. This place has so much soul, so much energy. To be here, to do this event together, to be on the stage with the great Mary Beard, it's just remarkable. And I'm very grateful. So thank you so much for making this happen. And I know we will be discussing some difficult issues as well, but I really think this is the right place to have these discussions. And literature is also the right space for that, so that we can hold more nuanced conversations. So I'm really, really looking forward to this. As you kindly mentioned, there are three characters in this book, or maybe I can say this is the story of three characters, two rivers, and one ancient poem. So 3, 2, 1. And everything in this book is connected via a tiny drop of water. So basically, I think I wanted to know or see if I could build an entire novel on a single droplet, something that is seemingly insignificant, but of course is not. You know, we cannot take water for granted. I come from the Middle East, and as we're speaking, our rivers are drying and our rivers are dying. Of the most 10 water-stressed nations in the world, 7 are in the Middle East and in North Africa. And this has massive consequences, of course, for everyone, but particularly for women, because women are water carriers. They bring water to their communities. When there's no water, the distance that a woman has to walk in order to fetch water increases, unfortunately increasing the possibility of gender violence on the way or on the way back. So all these issues are connected. And I thought, water was perhaps a good story to see how connected we are. And the reason why I mentioned this is because the three characters in the book are connected as if in a water molecule. So they're my H2O. There are the two H hydrogen molecules. We will come to those characters. And there's oxygen at the center, which is Arthur.
Yes, and just tell us a little bit about Arthur, because Arthur is loosely based on a real character, George Smith, who worked in the British Museum and was revolutionary in actually decoding the Epic of Gilgamesh. And he's an unsung hero of world literature, actually. And you start with Arthur at the very beginning. You have to think, we'll sometimes say Arthur and sometimes say George.
Yes.
They're the same person. Elif starts with Arthur at the very beginning of his life.
Yes. So I call him in the book King Arthur of the Sewers and the Slums. And there's a reason why he's given this unusual name. He's born in the slum tenements of Chelsea at the time, by the river. He's a river child. And in the story, he also dies by the river. And basically, as Mary pointed out, I loosely based this character on an actual historical figure who was George Smith. And if I may add this, I peppered Dr. Sebastian Rey with so many questions when I was writing this book, and he always kindly answered my questions. George Smith is a fascinating character. Maybe it's an unusual thing for an author to say this, but I really, really fell in love with this character. I love the character, and maybe I wanted more people to know about him. I think if he had been born today, we're talking about a boy who was born into poverty. He has never been given a proper education, and he has an amazing visual memory, which, if he were alive today, we would probably respect. We might have recognized the neurodivergence of his mind, the beauty of his mind, and this remarkable visual memory that he had. With very little education, the actual George Smith, he comes to the British Museum during his break time, just lunchtime, lunch break, and he just keeps looking at these shuttered cuneiform tablets. If I may open a parenthesis very quickly, now these cuneiform tablets, clay tablets, it's a remarkable story. So we go thousands of years back. Remember when I talked about this drop of water at the beginning, thousands of years back in the beginning of the book, it falls on the head of a mighty king, King Ashurbanipal, who changed the course of history because he had this very important library. And in that library, we're talking about thousands of cuneiform tablets. Among those tablets is the story of Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, the actual George Smith in Victorian era is the person who discovers the Epic of Gilgamesh and who decodes, in particular, the Flood tablet. He falls in love with the poem, and in order to find the missing lines in the poem, he comes to the region twice. He loses his life there, and today he's buried between Syria and Turkey. And there's one thing I just want to add at this point. There are many things which stimulate young Arthur in your book, but one of those is coming across, because his employer shows it to him, coming across Layard's 1849 book, Nineveh and Its Remains. And combined with the tablets, the extraordinary impact of the sculpture, is the idea that Layard can decode that ancient city of Nineveh. And Sebastian very kindly brought down not just a copy of it, but Layard's own copy of it, in which he has annotated his book when he goes back to Nineveh and has different experiences. So we're not allowed to hand it around, but if anybody wants to look at it, I can show. There's 2 volumes. They're quite extraordinary, and it comes up as a sort of leitmotif in Elif's book. Indeed, and I think Layard's book is quite important for the story as well, because He not only writes, of course, about his discovery, the cultural artifacts, which make a huge, groundbreaking moment in history, but also he writes about the people he meets along the way, right? The people of the region, the minorities of the region, including the Yazidis. And when we talk about the Yazidis, maybe we will come at that later. We're talking about one of the most persecuted minorities in the world. Unfortunately, sometimes, many times called as quote-unquote devil worshippers in the region. The Yazidi lore talks about 72 massacres throughout history. Of course, the 2014 genocide happened in front of the eyes of the world. But before that, there are multiple massacres. So Layard is also a witness to the struggles of the minorities of the region. And in that regard, he's an important name for me.
In what people like me call Mesopotamia, but other people don't. It was Layard that got these creatures back here. We can talk about the rights and wrongs of that later. But what about the other two threads, Zeliha? What about the Yazidi thread? How does that fit?
So the third character is a little Yazidi girl, and this story starts in a place in Turkey called Hasankeyf. The old name was Castrum Kefa. We're talking about a 12,000-year-old civilization in southeastern Anatolia, today in Turkey. And if you go there today, that place does not exist anymore. What you see in its stead, it's just water, because it has been flooded in order to build a dam that has the lifespan of only 50 years. In order to build that dam, they have destroyed 12,000 years old history. They have destroyed biodiversity and the entire ecosystem. So it was a very controversial project. And the story starts there. They travel, she and her grandmother, towards Iraq. And unfortunately, this is the summer of 2014 when ISIS starts its horrible genocide against the Yazidi minorities. If I may add these 2 points, the very first thing ISIS did when they started the attack was to poison the wells. They killed the water first. And the second thing they did was to kill the elderly. The Yazidi communities don't, I don't want to say they don't rely on written culture much. It's a minority that transmits memory through oral storytelling, right? So ballads, stories. So the second thing ISIS did was to kill the elderly, which means they killed collective memory. Then they killed the men and they kidnapped women and children. As we're speaking right now, there's more than 3,000 women and girls missing. And something happened when I was writing this book. I read about a Yazidi girl who was saved from a house in Ankara, in a neighborhood very close to the neighborhood where I grew up, my maternal grandmother's house, literally 2 or 3 streets away. This girl was saved. And these children are kept as sexual slaves. So these are questions that are very, very difficult, but I think must be raised. You know, how come that kind of numbness sinks in? How come in these so-called ordinary neighborhoods, there are still 3,000 women missing?
So you've got Arthur, and then your second character is Nareen, who is going to be and becomes, spoiler alert here, a victim of the Yazidi genocide. But then you're back in the UK right up to date, and you have another woman who's also deeply connected with water.
Yes, and her name is Zeliha. She's the child of immigrants, and she's a water scientist. And while I was writing her character, I had to do so much research into water science, and I loved every moment of it. So basically, Zeliha researches, is studying rivers, but not only the rivers that we see, but also the rivers that we do not see. For instance, there are atmospheric rivers in the sky. We don't talk about them, we don't see them, but they're there. They're the biggest rivers, actually, in our planet. But also there are underground rivers, lost rivers or buried rivers. And I think that metaphor of things being buried, but still being alive, still continuing to shape us, is an important metaphor in my writing. So she's studying those lost rivers, of which London has so many. This is a city of lost rivers, isn't it? But so is New York, so is Moscow, so is Tokyo, for instance, or Athens, beautiful Athens. When you go to Athens today, you don't see rivers, but actually there are 3 buried rivers under the city. So we built our cities above these rivers, thinking they were unnecessary or they were filthy, they were dirty. But of course, there's no such thing. And with rising water levels, I think that system cannot be sustainable anymore. We're going to see more and more flash floods. So now there's a counter movement to bring those lost rivers into daylight. And they call it daylighting. They started in South Korea. And so she's a scientist who is very much into this kind of work.
I think I found, mind-blowing about the book was how you've got these three storylines, these three characters. They are linked by place. Most of it takes place either on the banks of the Thames or on the banks of the Tigris. So you've got two main rivers that link these people. And they link in... I'm not going to do a spoiler here. They link in all kinds of different ways, and there are all sorts of surprising connections between these people, between now and Victorian period. And there are lots of wonderfully satisfying bits. I pointed to Layard's book on Nineveh. Well, actually, the hydrologist, the final character, Zuleika, she borrows Layard's Nineveh from her uncle because he's been reading it, partly because he's about to buy a probably smuggled bit of Assyrian antiquity. And she's also interested in it because, this is just a BM reference, she's having a growing friendship with a woman who has a tattoo parlour just opposite the British Museum, where she will give you a tattoo in cuneiform. Right. Sadly, I think she doesn't exist, otherwise we'd all be there. But what is really kind of in your face is the idea that water is something that actually an awful lot of people so far in the West, though I suspect it's changing, have taken for granted. We don't notice it. We don't think of the history of a raindrop. It is a thing that just splashes down and goes away. And we are only just becoming aware of water's capacity to be misused, actually. Water is life-giving, but it can be extremely dangerous. And rather too many people, in a sense, if you're wanting a comfortable read, rather too many people in Elif's book die because of water, because the misuse of water is absolutely lethal. And at one point you say, and I think absolutely rightly, that we shouldn't perhaps talk about climate crisis. We should talk about water crisis, and what your book is about in some ways, from the dam which dispossesses the Yazidis to cholera-infected water in Victorian London. You're saying notice water more because it is what links us.
Indeed. And if I may share this with you, the wonderful art historian Katie Hessel, she sent me a picture yesterday of a bookseller who had a tattoo of the sign of water, which is in the book on the first page in cuneiform. So I think it would be a great tattoo idea. But I so fully agree with everything you said. Notice water, I think, is such an important motto for our age, because when we're talking about climate crisis, basically we're talking about freshwater crisis, of course. And even in our city, the Thames is such a remarkable, extraordinary river, but it's a zombie river, isn't it? Because not that long ago, it was declared dead. It was so filthy, it was so dirty because of us, as human beings, the way we mistreated the river. It was biologically declared dead. And now it is home to more than 200 biospecies. So what the river has done in terms of renewing itself is really extraordinary. But yet we do not learn, again, as humans, we do not learn much from history. Sometimes we draw circles. And again, as we're speaking in the name of profit, for making money, for more greed, water companies are pumping sewage back into the river. So are we going forward? What exactly is progress? Do we move in a linear arc throughout history? I think these are also questions that the book tries to address. And one final point, if I may make, with regards to what Mary said, water is really the connecting element. We tend to think that it's a very different water, the one that flows in the Ganges River, or the one in the Euphrates, or the one in Mississippi. But actually, it's the same water that's circulating. It's the same water that we might have cried yesterday, our tears, or the water that we drink, or the water that we have inside. So I think if we want to know how connected we are, not as human beings, fellow human beings, but also how connected we are with nature. We're not above nature. We're just a small part of an ecosystem. We have to look no further than the story of water.
Yeah. And there's a wonderful bit in the appendix where you give the life history of a water drop going back to the reign of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and right up to now. But I think also, water is a really crucial and I think very cleverly executed linking theme. But I was also struck, as I read it again yesterday, I was struck more on the second reading by other themes that linked these different stories that we've got. And one of those is the theme of memory. And you've alluded to it already. The point about Arthur is he remembers everything. He is an individual who never forgets. And that in all kinds of ways is his passport, in the hierarchy of Victorian London, to being able to get out of the slums and sewers. But how memory operates for different communities comes in throughout. And your young Yazidi victim, Nareen, she is slowly going deaf. And one of the questions is, what kind of memory do you have when you can't any longer hear? And I was really struck by trying to weigh up the, in a sense, extraordinarily extreme Arthur, who will tell you what day of the week it was on the 5th of December, 1856, right? And what happened. So it's a kind of, it's memory gone mad with people whose memories have been removed for them, or even the hydrologist, Salika's uncle, who has himself come from Iraq, has made it really big in the UK. He's in the House of Lords. He's done everything right. And yet one thing he doesn't do is remember anything. Mm-hmm. He has no memory, no meaningful memory.
Yeah. Because I think it goes hand in hand. Memory, conscience, and identity, doesn't it? And it's a question that I think about a lot as a storyteller. I come from Turkey, a country that has, of course, a very rich history, a very complex history, but that doesn't translate into strong memory. I think quite the opposite. We are a society of collective amnesia in Turkey. And so our relationship with the past is full of ruptures. And when you have so many ruptures, usually that void is filled in by ultranationalist, more Islamist, more, grandiose interpretations of the past. But if you start asking seemingly small questions, for instance, how was life like for an Armenian silversmith, or a Jewish miller, or a Kurdish peasant, or an Arab farmer, or a Greek sailor? How was life like for women in the Ottoman Empire? How was life like for a concubine, for instance? The moment you start asking these questions, there's silence. And I think as writers, we need to be not only drawn to stories, but also to silences. Where are the silences and who are the silenced, in those narratives? And for that, I want to come back to oral storytelling and oral history. It is so crucial because what written culture forgets, oral culture often remembers. And so for the minorities, if you want to dig, I think writers need to be a bit like linguistic archaeologists. We need to dig deep into those layers of silences. And we have to look at oral history in particular and oral culture, because there is a memory there that's transmitted usually by women. Women are memory keepers as well, from grandmothers to grandchildren. So in the case of Narine, when she starts losing her hearing ability, her connection with her grandmother is broken. Her grandmother is not a well-educated woman. She's not capable of turning her stories into written texts. She talks about those stories. So it's an oral transmission that is being lost. So all I'm trying to say, it's an endlessly important for me, the connection between memory, conscience, and identity.
Yeah. And, one of the questions I think that runs right through the book is, do we make some people's stories count more than others? Now, whose stories count in the world? And at one point, we'll come on to this in a minute, you talk about the museum as a place where it both helps us remember and also helps us forget. And the story, whose stories are heard and how, is absolutely central to any cultural enterprise. And I think that comes over loud and clear. But, I think we ought to look at, just briefly, at the Yazidi genocide of 2014, because your account of what happens to this little girl and to her family is chilling and upsetting and horribly vivid. And I suppose I wanted to ask you two questions about that. One is, what do you gain or what do you lose by telling those stories in fiction rather than in non-fictional reportage? Yeah. And what do you think that the archaeological background to this, the culture of the Tigris and the Euphrates, Mesopotamia, this kind of stuff, does that add to the story?
Thank you so much. Beautiful questions. For me, fiction is where my heart beats. Fiction is how I connect with the world. Of course, there can be many more non-fiction books about all these subjects, but I think fiction does something in its own special way. Fiction, when we use the word fiction, actually is quite misleading because we think it has nothing to do with truth. But actually, fiction deals with truth in a very different and, in my opinion, honest way, and also in a very emotional way. There is a connection between our emotions and memory. When there are studies that show when we go to a talk, if the talk is conveyed mostly through numbers, graphics, statistics, 24 hours later, we've forgotten about 56% of the talk. 3 days later, more than 75% is gone in our memory. But if the same talk is given to us through stories and emotions, we remember. What do we remember? How it made us feel. Like the great Maya Angelou said, she said, people might forget what you said. People might even forget what you've done to them, but they will never forget how you made them feel. So it's always those emotions that stay with us. And I think inside fiction, there is room and space for multiplicity. For me, this is so important because in our daily lives, we're constantly being pushed into these dualities, being pigeonholed, labeled. But when we enter a work of fiction, I think my job as a writer is not to try to give any answers. I don't know the answers myself. The only thing I know is I care about the questions, including difficult questions about difficult issues, such as who tells the story of the past and who is not allowed to tell that story. That's an important question. But you need to create a free space where a multiplicity of opinions can be heard, and then you need to let the reader decide, because every reader is going to come up with their own answers, right? So I've met couples who have been married for 45 years. They read the same book. They don't read it in the same way. One loves it, the other one not so much. I've met good friends who share each other's every secret. They read the same novel. One of them loves one character, the other one hates that character. Why? Because the reader is not passive. They bring their own gaze. So all I'm trying to say is, inside the work of fiction, I think there's this beauty of celebrating multiplicity of thought, nuanced thought, and a question about cultural artifacts and who owns the past, which is a very complex issue and an incredibly important issue. We cannot avoid or postpone this question. Can be discussed inside the work of literature and definitely not on social media where we're just reduced to snippets of slogans.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very interesting that we, not obviously in the case of the 2014 genocide, but of various bouts, horrible bouts of persecution of the Yazidis 100 years, more than 100 years earlier. I think we're helped in the novel to see that through the art. We see that there is a history to this, and we see it through the eyes of our author, the archaeologist, the naive, nerdish archaeologist whose eyes are opened to it. And in a sense, his eyes being open to it opens ours.
Indeed, and I so appreciate that you say this, because throughout the story, Arthur goes through a transformation, and he tackles. I mean, he struggles with these questions. At first, he's very sure that this is where the artifacts will be taken better care of, and this is where they belong. But the more he gets to know the people of the region, especially the minorities of the region, this for me is very important. Today, when we talk about cultural artifacts and questions about repatriation, almost never the minorities are mentioned, right? It's always governments. For instance, in the case of Iraq, I don't hear many people talking about, for instance, the minorities of the region also having a say on this issue. So it's a very, very complex issue, and Arthur realizes this. One thing that disturbs him is, upon coming to London, seeing the artifacts of from Nineveh, in particular in the book, in the hands of the wealthy, just because they can afford to buy them. That's something that bothers him immensely. So he starts questioning his own role in this.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the book also talks about the destruction of ISIS and what happened to these artifacts. ISIS not only destroyed them, there was a big show, in my opinion, to the world in these videos saying we're destroying everything, left and right. But underneath that veneer, ISIS also made profit from selling, from illegally smuggling these items. So there's that complexity. But my point is, again, coming back to the beauty of literature and art, we can be quite critical, and in my opinion, rightly so. We might debate this if you'd like. We can be quite critical of colonial institutional history and the way many artifacts have been brought from other people's lands. At the same time, we can have respect for the passion and genuine dedication of individual archaeologists and scholars, such as George Smith, who, as I said, fell in love with a poem and in his own naive way, came to the region to find the missing line. So we can do both things inside literature.
Yeah, and we've now come on to, if you're reading this from a museum perspective, is one of the big questions in the book, which is about who owns the past. It's about cultural property. It's about the rights and wrongs of moving the past across the world. And I think that Arthur does take us on a journey that we start with him becoming entranced by these things. Actually managing to see what these cuneiform tablets mean. He wants to go out and find the missing bits. And at the very beginning, he's being told, and he's taking on board this idea that Western civilization has a duty. It's a duty that in the end kills him, actually. He dies, as you said, on the banks of the Tigris. He has a duty to save it. And as it goes further on, there is no way that Arthur Smythe becomes a restitutionist. But he does start to repeatedly wonder about what the role of archaeology is in the world order, and not just who has a right to have their stories heard, but who has a right to the objects. And he's very nice about the clash towards the end, between Gilgamesh and these things when he says, no, nobody owns a poem. We can all own Gilgamesh. But there is something different about material objects. And so we go on his journey, which is just increasingly questioning about what the stake of the archaeologist is, what the stake of the museum is. So in part, the museum that you conjure up is a museum of sheer pleasure, actually. It's wonderful. You know, Zuleika meets her tattoo artist from across the road here, just where we are, and then they have a coffee in the Great Court, and it's absolutely wonderful. And that, I think, you said a bit ago, it's great to be able to chew this over in fiction, rather than just sound off on social media as if these questions were simple.
That's so true. And I think most of this debate is also related to identity, isn't it? We tend to think of identity in a very solid, static, and almost monolithic way, which immediately creates a perception of us versus them, you know, here versus there. But I think if we could start to think of identity in a much more liquid way, in a much more fluid way, of course, it's very normal and beautiful, actually, for everyone to feel very attached to the land of their ancestors or where they're coming from or their cultural identity in that regard. So that's maybe one circle. Many ancient philosophers, Greek philosophers, actually wrote about this identity like water ripples in a lake. So that's one circle. But then you can also feel connected to your country. You can also feel connected to the continent where you come from, and the circles get bigger and bigger. In my case, I think, of course, Turkish. I feel also attached to the Balkans, the Middle East. There are elements in my soul. I feel European, the values that I share, also by birth. I become British over the years. And despite what politicians have been telling us in this country, I would like to think of myself as a citizen of humankind. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because, on the one hand, it's of course wonderful that so many people from all over the world can come and visit this museum. At the same time, it is not enough, in my opinion, to say, well, the people of those lands, whenever they want, they can come and visit these artifacts. So few people have the access to, even getting a visa. So we cannot continue with this argument, in my opinion. But the important thing is to be open to discussing, these important and complex issues, especially in a place like this. I honestly believe that the museums should lead these conversations, should engage in these conversations. And we need new solutions. We need a new narrative. Sometimes this could be a loan. Sometimes this could be definitely repatriation. In other cases, it might be maybe digital replicas, but we can come up with better solutions rather than trying to suppress these questions, which are important questions. The final thing that I want to add is there's a hurt. In many parts of the world, people have not forgotten. They might have lost their objects, but the memory of what they have lost is still alive, and that memory is transmitted. So we have to find a new conversation, a new narrative, in my opinion, not as citizens of here or as citizens of there, but as citizens of humankind.
Yeah, the big question then is, what does it mean to say that these things that we're sitting between, in a way they belong to everybody, they both belong to everybody, and they belong to the British Museum, and they sort of belong to the place where they were first displayed. And those are really complicated issues of ownership and belonging, and what should happen to them. And I suppose I thought it was almost best done, at least as a kick-off, in fiction, because you were able to see good people's perspectives differ on this. And it is, in some ways, what you say makes the museums seem, or any museum, seem a wonderful place that modern culture needs. At one point you say brilliantly, or rather one of your characters does, I doubt any therapists, this is Zalika's friend, I doubt any therapists would send their patients to the British Museum. But when you're next to something so impossibly old, it kind of puts things in perspective. And I think that's brilliant. And she goes on to say, referring to these, the technical term is lamassu. I think everyone should hang out with a lamassu every now and then. And so there's a warmth of feeling for the museum, but also a recognition in other parts of the book about who's excluded by that. And it's hard to get your head around.
Yes, and I think, again, that's the beauty of literature. But knowledge is so important, isn't it? Because I think we live in an age in which we're bombarded by information, but there's very little knowledge and maybe even less wisdom. And it's a question, how do we change that ratio? Maybe let's spend less time with information, but more time with knowledge, hopefully more time with wisdom. I think for knowledge, we need nuanced conversations, not snippets of information. The snippets of information is just an illusion. It gives us the impression that we know the subject, but we forgot to say, I don't know. You know, I don't know was an amazing point. It was the beginning of philosophy to be able to say, I don't know. Now we can Google anything, everything. In the next 5 minutes, I can say anything about, any subject, but that's not knowledge. So I think for knowledge, we need to slow down. And it's very important that museums open up these doors of knowledge. Like, how did these artifacts end up here? It wasn't a smooth journey on the way, somewhere broken, somewhere lost. But when I say this, I'm also saying this again as a Turkish writer who is aware of the role of the Ottoman authorities, for instance. Let's also discuss that. And when I say this, I also want to talk about the role of, for instance, the fanatics who have destroyed the cultural artifacts. Let's also talk about that. But those are all layers and layers of knowledge. But eventually, hopefully, this is a conversation that can go towards wisdom. And I think for wisdom, we need to bring together the mind and the heart. So that requires an emotional attachment. That requires empathy. And I think empathy has to lead this discussion.
Yeah. And I think we now ought to open it up to a wider discussion. I should just say that if I had a favourite page in this novel, it's a wonderful novel. My favourite page is page 61, where you see young Arthur outside the British Museum. He's employed in a printmaker's outfit. He has very little time off. His dad is a drunkard. His mum is really non-functional. And he's very attracted by the British Museum. And one day he leaves the printmaker in Covent Garden and he comes here and he sees a crowd of people outside the museum. And what's going on is that these figures are being brought in. They're being wheeled in and up the steps, and loads of people have come to look. And he's struck by wonderment, but it's not just the wonderment that was what kind of got me. It's that he finds himself next to some old guy and asks for a bit of explanation. And it turns out that the old guy he's standing next to is Samuel Birch, who was the keeper of the department. I don't know what it was called then. Orient, thank you, Sebastian. And so he explains a bit, and he realises that Arthur is a strange but very interesting kid. And he says to Arthur, if you want to come and see them, you come in, go up the steps, and just ask for me, because no one will then throw you out, and I will show you. 4 years later, that sort of happens. But there is a kind of glimpse there of the way that this working class lad's life is overturned by the kindness of one fairly crusty, has to be said, an old curator who just spots that he's interested. And the real problem, and this is what you're saying, I think, the real problem is to put that real experience, that wonderful experience, next to what we know about rapacity, exploitation, imperialism, etc., because both those stories are true in some way.
Indeed, yes. Both those stories need to be told side by side, yeah.
I think we should now open this up. I don't know if we've got some mics. We have. I don't have my glasses on, so I don't have to look at the Venus. You'd like to ask a question? Just hands up, and or make a comment. Hands up, and a mic will come to you. And we've time travelled a long way, so there'd better be some. Yes.
Not a very thrilling question, but at least kicks it off, which is, Elif, when you were thinking about this book, where did it come from for you? What brought you here? And also, as an aside, when did you first come to the British Museum? And do you have a clear memory? I work for the BBC, and I've spent quite a lot of time doing things about the British Museum recently, and including interviewing somebody who really remembers their first time that they came to the British Museum and how much time they spent here, because it's just full of the most incredible wonders. But I wonder for you when that was.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I came to the British Museum for the first time many years ago, but back then I wasn't living in the UK. And then ever since I moved here, I've been coming quite often. But while I was writing the book, that was a very different visit, because I was trying to visualize, where would George Smith be? What would be his room like? There is a lot of, in the archives, we can find a lot of information about him, but there are also, the blanks as well, So we need to, I think it's someone that the world should know more about. We need to know more about. So those last 2 years it was incredible. It was a very different type of visit. And especially in this part of the museum, I spent much more time. I've been also reading a lot. The reading, my reading was very eclectic, actually. How did the idea come to me? Actually, it came with a drop of water, but it also came with the Epic of Gilgamesh, I have to say. And perhaps you might assume that, coming from Turkey, I might be very familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh, that people in Turkey read about it. That is not the case. Our knowledge of the Epic of Gilgamesh is very superficial. And when I started reading properly the epic, I really was struck. So we're basically talking about the oldest piece of literature known in human history. And I think in so many ways, it is such a relevant story for our times. Gilgamesh, and I love Greek mythology, but unlike many Greek myths, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, there are no heroes. There's no hero in a conventional sense, just the opposite. To begin with, Gilgamesh is a terrible creature, terrible, awful man, half divine, and you wouldn't like him at all. But it's only through journeys and friendship and loss and defeat he comes back as a changed person and as a kinder person. So it's a story about the possibility for change, even from a very low and terrible place. There's hope. It's a story about tyranny, about the danger of power. It's also a story about taking other people's things, going into their lands. There are layers. It's a story about climate crisis. It's so unfortunate that today we associate the Middle East mostly with violence, conflict, at least the media coverage is like that. But we're talking about a land that was once upon a time home to the wealthiest civilizations, incredibly complex irrigation systems, right? So when you delve into the epic, you realize the complexity of the region. And I really think in many ways it's a story that should be told today. That's how everything began for me, from the drop of water to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which straight brought me into the flood tablet. If I may add one or two words about the flood tablet, it's so important what George Smith discovered, because that's what brought me into George Smith. When he starts reading the flood tablet, he realizes the story told there, about the deluge, the floods, water everywhere, an arc, or maybe I should say a coracle, like Professor Arvin Finkel pointed out, in which there are animals and human beings, how they fly a pigeon or a bird to see if there's a land nearby, and so on. So when he starts reading this, imagine his shock, because the story is very familiar, isn't it? It's the biblical story of the flood, except this was written thousands of years back. Not only that, before it was written, put on clay tablets by scribes, written down, it was transmitted orally. So we're talking about a very, very ancient epic, which is much, much older than the Old Testament. So it splits the Victorian society into two. Those who are more inclined towards religion, they say, well, you see, it proves that the sacred books were right. It shows that these things really happened. Whereas those who are more science-minded would say, actually, what the Old Testament or the biblical story is saying is the repetition of age-old stories over and over. So depending on where you stand, you can love the flood tablet for different reasons, which is exactly the story of what's happening today. So it's incredibly important and groundbreaking what George Smith discovered. But that's how everything started, from the drop of water to the Epic of Gilgamesh to George Smith.
And in a way, you get the feeling that Arthur, as the novel goes on, Arthur becomes a bit more like Gilgamesh.
So,
That he travels and he becomes kinder.
Yes.
And that's his poem.
Yes.
And he's seeing himself. Yeah. And there's something kind of moving in the way that you know this isn't going to end well.
Yeah.
It's been a wonderful conversation, so thank you, and I can't wait to read the book. But I want to ask a question which is more from the museum end. I wonder if you could both, in your own words, describe what you think the purpose of the International Museum in the 21st century is.
Oh, John, that's a really that's an easy one. Who's going to do this? To make us think about ourselves better and harder and more critically. I think that there is no point. I think Elif has been saying this a bit. There's no point in having a museum about which we all agree. Museums have to cherish the idea that their focus is of debate, that it's where we can disagree, it's where we can find, putting in this in modern terms, a safe space to have very difficult discussions. And I think in some ways that's what Elif's novel does. It shows that come at this from a slightly different angle, and you can talk about all kinds of things that you thought were, restricted to not very sophisticated bits of social media.
Yeah.
They should all go back. No, they should stay. You are ruining our culture. You are a load of thieves. Nobody's getting anywhere with that sort of talk. It's a way of finding out how the museum can embrace its responsibility to be difficult. Museums should be, Elif talks about them being good therapy, or her character talks about them being good therapy. I also think you should go away from a museum feeling discomforted a little bit, made to reflect a bit differently. I think there's wonderment. I shall never forget sitting here. There is wonderment, but it's about also wondering about how you know what you do. And I think, to put that more strongly, it's not just that we ought to cherish our debates and disagreements about museums. We ought to reckon that if we didn't have those debates, then the museum wouldn't be doing its job. And I think that's absolutely crucial. What would it be like to have a museum that we all agreed represented the past perfectly? It would be ghastly. And I think that one of the ways that you can get inside those issues, which we find it very hard to get inside in kind of stand-up debates, is fictionally.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you so much for the question. I think all empires have very difficult, complex debates that they need to face. When I say empires, debates about empires. But the difference between a democracy and a non-democracy is, in a democracy, we can walk into a bookstore, right, a bookshop, and easily find books that question the imperial legacy from different points of view, the good and the bad, the beauties and the atrocities. And the writers of those books are not arrested or prosecuted or imprisoned. It is incredibly important for a democracy, the health of a democracy, to be open to these discussions. It's not like one empire is better than other, anything like that. But the biggest difference is, are we open to having these debates? And these debates matter. And I really think institutions such as these, they're so important and so complex, and there's so much cultural heritage here. They should lead the way. I also think language matters a lot as a writer. For instance, the fact that we use the word, the definition, Elgin marbles, disturbs me. Why do we say Elgin marbles? They are not Elgin marbles. They're not Elgin's marbles either. They're Parthenon marbles or Parthenon structures. Even a detail like that, I think, matters. So to be open to this linguistic change, again, the museums leading the way in that linguistic change is also very important. But the third thing is, and I learned this from Dr. Sebastian Rey, because I know he's working in the region with many archaeologists in Iraq, also, helping a younger generation of Iraqi archaeologists, women, minorities, perhaps people who would not have access to that, kind of public education. So this is also very important. And I really think museums need to engage more in these massively important projects as well. And in the meantime, we definitely cannot postpone the debate that we are having. Let's keep engaging. We don't have to solve it. We cannot solve it in one go, but just to be open to having these nuanced conversations, especially through literature and art, I think is going to be a good way forward, a good step forward.
I think that is a bit like your neck of the woods, John. You work for the National Trust. I mean, one thing you're very open about, actually, in the book, and there aren't any obvious heroes here, and young Arthur is captivated by these things. You make it absolutely clear from page 1 that the Assyrian Empire was a very, very nasty place indeed, and that you can be both captivated, how not, by this. And everybody's captivated by their 5 legs, not 4. And, it's wonderful, but that's written on the back of slavery, exploitation, cruelty, and murder.
Of course, that's another chapter, and it's an important one, because in the library of Ashurbanipal, we're talking about thousands of tablets that were brought from all over the empire, but sometimes by force, by coercion, sometimes by deceit, sometimes, acquired perhaps more peacefully. But that's a very, very complex story, and especially the story of Ashurbanipal, who is the most educated king that the empire has ever seen, before or after. But it doesn't mean he's less cruel than his predecessors. So yes, that's another complex story.
Nasty men read books.
Oh, you'll see.
Sadly. 2, yes, thank you. Yeah, yes, that's nice men read books as well, but and women. We've got time for just one more, I think.
I'm just interested in the thread that introduced the recent experience of the Yazidi women, because of course it's currently right now the 10th anniversary of all of that happening, and it happened at the hands of those who were also captivated by a notional past. Because what they were seeking to do was to create a caliphate in a part of the world which they thought was much more related to their history of their religion, and that they wanted to create something which was challenging Western democracy, and the Yazidis got in the way of that, and signified something that even predated the coming of Islam or Christianity or Judaism, and they saw it as primitive and therefore deserving of annihilation. And it's another example of being caught up in a past that isn't necessarily truthful and isn't truthful, but which somehow captured the imagination of a rather ill-informed group of people.
Indeed, very, very much so. And of course, there's a nostalgia for a past that never was true. There's also a lot of ignorance. For instance, even the word Yazidi. I mean, there's a linguistic distinction that is very important in the part of the world where I come from, because in a very ignorant way, they think that the Yazidis are responsible for the killing of the Prophet's grandsons, which is not true at all. So there's a lot of ignorance and confusion as well. And as you said, pointed out, I think most importantly, there's dehumanization. Just to say they're not people of the book, so I can do whatever I want. But one of the things I wanted to show in the book was this is not only the story of 2014. What happened in 2014 was definitely a most extreme form of genocide. It happened in front of the eyes of the world. And earlier we talked about this single drop of water. For me, the most difficult chapter to write was the Sinjar Mount, when Yazidi families had to run away towards Sinjar. We're talking about more than 50 degrees temperature, no shade, no tree whatsoever. And the people that I talked with, the survivors or people who've been working with the survivors, those interviews were the hardest ones to listen. They told me how drops of water, families had to ration drops of water among their children to keep them alive. So that was something that made me realize you cannot take for granted even a single drop of water. The resilience of the Yazidi communities is just remarkable. But I think we have some very difficult discussions that we urgently need to have, especially now that there's this, in August, it was the 10th anniversary. It's not only ISIS coming from outside and perpetrating these crimes, but how is it possible that neighbor turns against neighbor is another story. And that's how, of course, the worst atrocities throughout history start. So dehumanization, how this has been systematic throughout the centuries, and how we as an international community have a responsibility, in my opinion, to help especially Yazidi women and children to heal. There's a lot of individual and collective healing that needs to happen. And I think we have a responsibility in that as well.
Yeah, it's very striking that in Layard's book, which we usually only quote the main title, Nineveh and its Remains, the subtitle says, with an account of a visit to the Chaldean Christians of Kurdistan and the Yazidis or devil worshippers. So that demonization of the Yazidis, is here in one of the founding texts of Assyrian studies, written into the subtitle. And so there is a history.
There's a history, yeah.
And it's a history within scholarship, as well as within modern geopolitics.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, I think it's why enabling boundaries are like that, actually. And that Syria, Turkey,
Yes.
of course, it reads a line to have.
Yeah.
So those countries, responsibility. But no, not so. These are what they use that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that comes out very clearly in what Elif is saying. And I think that I am going to, this is not really spoiler alert, but the young deaf girl, it's a terribly sad story, but for her there is a half-happy ending.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not a spoiler, yeah, we can say that.
Yeah, happy ending.
But just on that note, I mean, because we've been talking about really difficult subjects, right? Heavy subjects. I think again through literature, you can also talk about the dance between maybe melancholy and hope. What keeps us more optimistic? You know, how we find more resilience when we learn about each other's stories. That's why global solidarity matters, why global sisterhood matters. So I think, at least personally, that's something that I wanted to be able to hold in my hands, both the melancholy, but whatever the opposite is, the optimism, the hope, and the resilience. I think that's there as well, especially in the story of Yazidis, and also in the story of water.
Yeah. I think at this point it's time that everybody should be able to get a drink and some other refreshments. There's plenty of time before the kind of last orders will go just before 9 o'clock. But meanwhile, I should say, I think, thank you very much to Sebastian, who do come and look at these wonderful books by Layard. But I should also say, now he's here and I can direct him conveniently to him, that the British Museum is still involved in archaeology in the region, but with a rather different politics. And there is a collaborative excavation at Gersu, which has just got, he tells me, new funding. And in the British Museum's international training programme, there have been some outstanding students coming to learn and share their skills about archaeology from Iraq. So the tradition continues, but it's perhaps less imperialist and more sharing than it was. But the most important thing is to say thank you to Elaine.
Thank you so much for making this happen. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Go and enjoy yourself.
Thank you.